I'm working on a pattern for this shield style backdrop for the wall-mounted dragon head, so I'm going to be creating a digital version, but I still like to start out sketching. That way I can try a couple of ideas and have something to work from once I move into the modeling software. Once I had a couple of ideas I liked, I took a photo from above and then imported that into Fusion 360 as a canvas. It's symmetrical, so the great thing about moving into the design software is then I can just mirror that over and I know my template's going to be perfectly symmetrical. And I also created a couple of other layers to this piece, working from that same sketch, and then I was able to extrude those so that I could see what this looks like in 3D with the 3 layers that are going to compose the backdrop. And I can also just add in a couple of decorations, some colors, just to get some ideas for how this is going to look ultimately, and make any changes to the pattern as needed before printing it out. I like to turn on the cut lines so that I can see where each sheet is supposed to align to the next sheet when printing it out in this poster style. So then I just trim off 2 of the edges on each sheet and tape everything together. I am trimming off the excess, but leaving a bit of a border around the edge of my template, because I will trim that right against the line once I'm cutting out the final material. There's still a couple of blank sheets in there, so I pulled those out and put them back to use later for printing more parts. So I glued my pattern down with some spray adhesive, and I'm going to be cutting this out with a scroll saw. So this is my first scroll saw project. I wasn't really sure how this was going to work, but I just jumped in and added a couple of holes in those triangle areas because I know I'm going to need to insert the blade into that to cut out the parts in the negative space there. And I just went at it here, just trimmed off the outside edges because this was so large that I was having difficulty maneuvering the piece. The depth on the throat of this scroll saw is less than the depth of my project, so that definitely created some issues when you try to turn and you just are hitting the end of the project up against the end of the scroll saw. It's a bit of a pain. I found that I needed more holes cut into these areas to get the blade into a spot where I could cut out enough to be able to maneuver without hitting the scroll saw into the wood. Hadn't quite gotten comfortable with cutting these sharp corners, turning the saw, so I just went in and then backed out and came at it from the opposite angle to try to get that cut as cleanly as possible. Not the most beautiful cutting, but it got the job done. I started out with this setup on some blocks on the ground because I thought that would have the least vibrations. My table's super wobbly, but I found later that the table was okay, so I'll move that later in the project. First piece came out okay. I used that to trace the backer board because it's the same pattern just without the triangle pieces, and cut that out of another piece of the plywood. So next up, it's time for the exciting piece, which is the scroll pattern. I attached that onto another piece of the plywood with some spray adhesive. I found later that I really did not use enough glue, so I definitely needed to add more spray adhesive on this. This was, again, difficult to finagle all of these scroll patterns with the saw being shallower than the project itself. So I kept hitting against the wall and having to drill some new holes in the negative space, and a lot of taking the blade out, putting it back in, and trying to get around all of the corners. So I had to chop this out in small pieces in a lot of places so that I could get around to the next edge before I hit the back of the saw again. I left the center space intact until the end, so I had the most support on the piece while I was working in all of the finer details. That was scroll attempt number 1, and I stopped here because at this point I realized I had drilled into the positive space and started cutting away the part that I was supposed to be keeping, so I started over. And this time I scribbled out the areas that need to be cut out so I wouldn't get those confused. I didn't think it would be so difficult to keep it straight, but once you start cutting in there, it just all starts to look like it ought to be cut out. So new sheet of plywood, and had to trim away the outer edge again just because I need the most maneuverability possible with this being so large. And I was careful this time, and actually it turned out to be a good thing because I had a couple of minor mistakes that I was going to settle with on that first version, but once I cut away half of the scroll, it's like that one, there's no coming back. So I had to start over, and second time definitely was coming out better anyways. I was pretty worried about pieces of wood flying up from this because it was splintering out at the back quite a bit, and just in general I was worried about losing an eye or something, so I wore a face shield the whole time. Didn't end up having any accidents in that respect, but I felt safer wearing it. It was definitely a pain having to keep pulling the blade out and insert it into a different part of the scroll, but I guess that's the nature of scrolling. Definitely easier to see in to get the bottom of the blade in place with the saw up on a table instead of on the ground. This is the most wobbly table ever. I thought that that would cause problems, but the whole thing kind of has a lot of vibration to it anyways, so it didn't make any difference whether it's on the ground or on the table. Other than that, it's super comfortable standing up versus trying to work on the ground. Again, for all these scrolls, I had to just cut it out in whatever pieces I could get to, so I could then back up, turn around, and try to follow the next edge until I ran out of space. I used the finest blade I had for the scroll parts, and I used a bit of a thicker, wider blade for the outer edges. I think it makes it a bit easier to keep straight with a more substantial blade, but the smaller blade, of course, you get the most maneuverability for these detail areas. Also, if you see bugs crawling around in the background, it's love bug season, so they are everywhere. Even with adding what I thought was a lot of glue, my pattern was still popping up in some places. That was kind of a pain. I ended up turning the scroll saw to the slowest setting just to give me the most time to carefully try to follow these edges. Just try to get a handle on how to pivot the project and move it at the correct speed, spin it at the correct speed to get the best result. It got better as I went, but it was a little bit rough all the way through. My template was slightly larger than the wood itself, just by maybe 1/4 to 1/2 of an inch. So I just rounded the point off at the bottom, which is what I was planning on doing anyways. Just wanted to utilize the full height of the wood and then have a little bit extra that I would just shape out once I was cutting. I wasn't sure how fragile the outer edge was going to be once I started cutting out the whole centerpiece, so I decided to get the bottom rounded part cut out first. I think it probably would have been okay. Now that I have it finished, I can see how sturdy the plywood is, but I was so worried about screwing this up on the very last part that I was erring on the side of caution. I didn't manage to break any blades, but I did bend the pins on one for some reason. When I tightened it up, I had it in crooked or something and it just bent. So, one blade casualty for this project, not too bad. Alright, I was pretty excited when I finished this, and then I went and set it onto the other pieces and found some sort of strange error here. For some reason, this scroll piece is very slightly smaller on all sides than the other two pieces that I cut out. I am still not entirely sure how I managed to export it from Fusion at a slightly different scale than the other parts. I double checked, it wasn't done in Photoshop, it was the original export that was the wrong size. So that's why I suggest that you export all your pieces on one sheet when possible. It's just one less chance for introducing error. Luckily, in this case, I had some extra wood, and so I just replaced the piece that had the triangle cutouts because that would have gotten too skinny at the top part if I just trimmed it smaller. And the backboard, I just trimmed the edges to match the scroll size, and it still fit the dragon head, so it was fine. It was only just a couple of percents smaller on the scroll piece, so it was just very minor, but enough on this large piece that it was noticeable. But on the printed template, those 1 centimeter cubes, I went back and double checked, they seemed to be the right size. So I don't know if it was just such a small amount that I couldn't tell with the line weight that it was smaller on those parts, or if somehow the scroll part exported smaller than the reference box. Who knows? But it's just like, you gotta be careful, and no matter how careful you are, there's always room for human error. So my beautiful scroll work was imperfect, to say the least. I used a couple of different sanding tools to clean this up. I've got a tungsten carbide block that was good for cleaning up the straight edges, and then a tungsten carbide round bit that's good for shaping on outer curves and straight edges. I found that helpful. And then just a variety of sanding tools, such as the tiny cylinders for very detailed areas, and then some larger cylinders for the larger curly parts, just to smooth out all the edges and get rid of all the splinters on the back, especially the areas where I kind of went over the same cut a couple of times with the scroll saw. That definitely caused a lot more splintering at the back, but the front was fine. I also have some files that are pretty useful just for getting into any tight areas and for trying to smooth out those inner edges somewhat. And of course some good old-fashioned hand sandpaper. Even though I didn't have enough glue in some areas, other areas the glue was a little bit too thick and gummed up the wood itself, probably because the nozzle needed to be cleaned. But I tried sanding it off and it didn't work, it just kept going deeper, so I grabbed some nail polish remover and that seemed to soften up the glue enough that I could scrape it off pretty well. Last thing now, to get these fitted together, I placed all 3 layers on top of each other and did the fine-tune fitting at that bottom tip where the wood wasn't really quite long enough, and I just need to make all 3 of them line up. Also along the sides, my cutting was somewhat imprecise, so that needed to be fitted together, smoothed with the tungsten carbide sanding block, and then just take off the bottom part too until those lined up pretty well. It's not going to be perfect just yet. I'll do one more careful fitting once I glue them together, just to make sure all the edges are lined up. I'm going to finalize the colors on everything all together here with the dragon head and then the different layers of wood, and then those will get clamped together with wood glue so that they all sit together flush. Then I'll be able to attach the hardware for the opening mechanism for that dragon head.